In the year 1831, nestled deep within the dense pine forests of Maine, the town of Harrowsfield presented itself as a picture of quiet devotion and simple, honest living. The air was thick with the scent of resin and damp earth, the towering pines casting long shadows over narrow dirt roads and whitewashed cottages. At the town's heart stood the Old Elm Church, its weathered steeple rising high, a silent sentinel over the lives beneath. The church bell tolled faithfully each morning and evening, marking time in a place that seemed untouched by the unrest of the outside world. The townsfolk, humble and pious, moved in rhythms dictated by prayer, harvest, and the whispered expectations of their neighbors. They spoke little, their voices hushed as if louder sounds might disturb the fragile peace they guarded so fiercely. Children played in small clusters, their laughter brief and quickly subdued, while women exchanged curt greetings, their eyes flickering toward shadows at the edges of vision. For beneath this calm surface lay an invisible tension, like a slow pulse beneath the skin. Rumors fluttered like moths in the dark, stories told only in wary glances and hurried whispers. Women disappeared without cause or explanation, slipping away as if swallowed by the towering pines themselves. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter, and men averted their eyes from the unexplained. Yet, no one dared speak openly of the vanishings or the growing unease that festered in the silence. At the center of this uneasy stillness was Reverend Elias Whitcomb, a man whose gentle demeanor and soft-spoken sermons masked a mind as labyrinthine as the forest that surrounded them. To the town, he was a shepherd of souls, a beacon of righteousness and comfort in uncertain times. Yet beneath his humble collar and weathered Bible was a mind meticulous and methodical, a mind that cloaked unspeakable cruelty behind a mask of innocence and divine purpose. His eyes held a quiet intensity, the kind that unsettled those who met his gaze for too long, as if he saw beyond their faces and into the marrow of their fears and secrets. The Reverend moved through Harrowsfield like a shadow, appearing where needed with unsettling precision, his presence both reassuring and chilling. The townsfolk spoke of him with reverence, unaware or unwilling to see the darkness he carried like a second skin. It was said that the church basement, a place no one but the Reverend and a select few entered, held secrets better left undiscovered. Whispers hinted at strange sounds echoing faintly through the church walls in the dead of night, murmurs that no prayer could silence. The very earth seemed to tremble with quiet dread beneath the feet of those who dared to pass the old elm's heavy wooden doors after sundown. In Harrowsfield, faith was a lifeline, but it was also a chain, binding the community to a terrifying silence. A silence that hid the vanished women, the whispered rumors, and the twisted purpose of a man who hid a monstrous mind behind the sanctity of Scripture. As the pine needles rustled in the cold wind and the church bell tolled once more, the quiet town beneath the pines held its breath, waiting for a truth none wished to confront. Beneath the polished wood floors of the Old Elm Church, hidden far from the gaze of the pious townsfolk, lay a sanctuary unlike any other, a labyrinth of cold stone chambers veiled in darkness and silence. Reverend Elias Whitcomb, the very image of holiness to Harrowsfield's devout community, had built this sanctuary with hands steady and heart unyielding, crafting not a place of refuge but a calculated prison. The air in the basement was thick with dampness and despair, an oppressive weight that seemed to seep into the very bones of the ancient structure. The scent of mildew mingled with something darker, faint traces of burnt herbs and something coppery like old blood whispered through the narrow corridors that twisted like the Reverend's own mind. Behind heavy oak doors bound by iron locks and hidden hinges, 18 women, once bright, living souls, were kept as shadows of themselves, their identities stripped away under the Reverend's cold, ritualistic hand. They were no longer seen as individuals but as vessels for his warped vision of salvation, prisoners caught in the slow unraveling of hope and sanity. Each chamber was designed with cruel intent, sparse, windowless, lit only by flickering candles that cast grotesque shapes against the cracked stone walls and silent except for the distant echo of restrained sobs or the faint scratching of nails on wood. The women were forced into a rigid obedience, taught that their suffering was a necessary path to grace, that their pain was a crucible purifying their souls. Yet beneath this veneer of divine purpose was a meticulous and methodical evil, a mind that dissected human fear and vulnerability as a scholar studies anatomy. The Reverend's duality was complete. By day, he was the gentle preacher whispering sermons of hope and mercy, and by night, a cold, remorseless tormentor orchestrating a slow, ritualistic undoing of these women's very essence. Among the faceless multitude was Abigail, a young woman who had once arrived with the naive hope of escape from a cruel world. Her eyes, when glimpsed through cracks or faint candlelight, reflected a flicker of something the Reverend could never fully extinguish. A fragile but defiant spark. She was a silent witness to the daily horrors inflicted in the name of faith, punishments that stretched beyond the physical to invade the mind itself. The Reverend employed rituals both cruel and cryptic, combining his twisted theology with a dark fascination for control. He believed that by breaking the flesh he could purify the spirit, that through ritual suffering these women would be cleansed from the sins of the world and from their own existence. His acts were deliberate and measured, the whispered chants that accompanied the locking of each door, the slow, cold application of ritual scars to mark his saved, and the way he watched from shadowed alcoves as obedience was enforced not only by pain but by psychological erasure. Outside, the congregation sang hymns of light and redemption, unaware that beneath their feet, within stone walls that drank in their prayers, a far darker ritual unfolded, a sacrament of cruelty concealed behind the guise of salvation. In this subterranean sanctuary, time seemed to stretch and twist, days blurring into endless nights, each marked by the cold routine of suffering. The Reverend moved among his captives with a calm precision, his hands never trembling as he administered punishments designed to crush will and reshape souls. Yet in the shadows, the captives clung to fragments of memory and whispered hope, their identities fragmented but not entirely lost. The Reverend's secret sanctuary was more than a prison. It was a twisted altar where faith was weaponized and innocence corroded, a place where a man cloaked in sanctity orchestrated methodical evil that few could imagine and fewer dared to uncover. The walls themselves seemed to listen, absorbing the silence and fear, becoming unwilling witnesses to a mind so dark and disciplined it turned horror into ritual and captivity into a macabre offering to an unseen god. As the cold stone corridor swallowed the Reverend's retreating footsteps, the silence settled once more, a silence born of terror, faith, and the slow, grinding work of a hidden psychopath's hand. Abigail's memories were fractured shards of a life once lived in the sunlit corners of Harrowsfield, before the shadows swallowed her whole. She remembered the sharp scent of freshly sewn fabric, the rhythmic clatter of her needle-piercing cloth, and the gentle hum of the village's small tradespeople bustling through their days. As a seamstress, her hands were skilled and steady, weaving beauty from scraps, hoping to carve a quiet existence away from the harsher edges of the world. It was a promise of safety that led her to the Old Elm Church, where the Reverend, with his soft voice and gentle eyes, offered work and shelter from the biting cold that seeped through the wooden walls of her modest home. The church, he said, was a sanctuary for those in need, a place where faith could mend broken souls. But what waited beyond the heavy doors was a trap woven with patience and cruelty. When Abigail entered, she felt the first threads of hope tighten into a noose. The Reverend's kindness was a mask, an invitation into a carefully constructed prison. Her memories flickered between moments of stark terror and unsettling calm, a numbness that settled deep inside her bones, dulling the edges of pain and fear. She recalled the long hours spent in the cold stone chambers, the absence of sunlight, and a slow erosion of time and self. Yet it was not the bruises or the chains that broke her spirit. It was the silence imposed upon her, the ritualistic stripping away of identity, and the psychological games designed to twist hope into despair. The Reverend's cruelty was methodical, far beyond the reach of mere physical violence. He wielded isolation as a weapon, severing the captives from each other, forcing them into solitary confinement where the mind became its own prison. Abigail remembered the soundless hours when the only companion was the oppressive weight of her own thoughts, a cacophony of guilt and confusion whispered by a voice that was not her own. He claimed it was divine punishment, a trial to cleanse their souls, but the rituals were little more than carefully staged performances of control. Abigail was forced to wear garments woven with coarse, itchy fabric, a constant reminder of her fallen state, and marked by faint symbols etched into her skin, invisible but unyielding. Each day began and ended with prayers that felt less like solace and more like chains tightening around her will. The Reverend watched her, his gaze unblinking, a silent judge who measured every tremor of fear or flicker of defiance. The ritual humiliations were quiet but devastating, being made to kneel for hours on cold stone, being forced to recite prayers that twisted meaning into mockery, and the subtle, cruel isolation from any human touch or kindness. Abigail's memories blurred at the edges, where hope and despair met in a haze of shadow and light, the promise of salvation warped into an endless cycle of suffering. Yet beneath the weight of this psychological torment, a small ember of resistance flickered within her, a desperate, fragile will to hold on to something real, something beyond the Reverend's dark design. Her past was no longer hers alone. It was consumed by the slow unraveling of faith-turned weapon, a haunting reminder that the most precise and terrifying forms of cruelty often wear the face of compassion. As Abigail's memory faded into the cold silence of the church basement, the shadow of the Reverend loomed larger, his twisted mind crafting new rituals in the darkness, each designed to snuff out the light of those trapped beneath the steeple's watchful eye. Within the stone walls of the church's basement, there existed a chamber unlike any other, a small, windowless room lined with thick, soundproofed panels that swallowed every whisper, every footstep, and every breath. This was the site of Reverend Elias Whitcomb's most cruel invention, a ritual he called the Silent Psalm. It was not the lash of a whip or the bite of cold iron that marked this torment, but the absence of everything familiar, sound, sight, and touch, stripped away until only the mind remained trapped in its own restless darkness. The captives were led one by one into this chamber, their voices snatched away, their senses numbed by the unyielding stillness that pressed against their skin like a living weight. Once the heavy oak door closed behind them, the silence devoured all but the faintest thread of sound, an eerie chant rising from the shadowed corners of the church, the low rhythmic voice of the Reverend echoing just beyond reach. This chant was both a lullaby and a curse, a whispered invocation meant to break the spirit while binding it tighter to his will. The room's walls seemed to breathe with the reverberations of his voice, pressing the captives further into a place where time stretched and warped, where moments lost meaning and sanity began to fray at the edges. The mind, starved of sensory input, clawed desperately for anchors, grasping at echoes of memories and fading hopes. Hours, sometimes days, passed in this darkness where the simplest thought could spiral into madness. The Reverend's design was clinical and deliberate. He observed the process with a cold detachment, noting how each woman's resolve chipped away, how their minds folded inward until they became silent, empty vessels. His assistant, Samuel, was a figure of quiet obedience, silent as the chamber itself, tasked with preparing the space, ensuring the locks held firm and recording the subtle changes in the captive's behavior. Samuel's presence was a constant shadow, a reminder that no one was truly alone in the darkness, but that human contact was a cruel illusion, offering no comfort, only surveillance. The ritual's pace was methodical. The captives entered without warning, deprived suddenly of all sensation and left trembling, hollowed, sometimes on the brink of collapse. The Reverend believed that in this void, where the world's noise was stripped away, the soul's true nature was revealed, cleansed through absence and submission. Yet this was not purification, but a slow disintegration, a breaking down of identity until the women were no more than husks, compliant and invisible. The silent psalm exploited the human vulnerability to silence and invisibility, weaponizing the mind's desperate need for connection and certainty. It was a cruelty that left no mark on the skin but carved deep scars into the psyche, a torment so precise that it escaped notice beyond the stone walls and iron locks. Abigail, among the captives, felt the ritual's full weight as a kind of drowning, her thoughts thrashing in the suffocating quiet, her hope dimming with each whispered chant. The chamber became her world and her prison, a place where time lost meaning and the Reverend's voice was both judge and executioner. In this ritual, the Reverend's twisted piety revealed itself in full, a man who cloaked methodical evil in the language of faith, who believed that silence could be both penance and power. The silent psalm was more than torture. It was an act of domination, a spiritual erasure crafted with cold precision. As the captives emerged, their faces pale and eyes distant, the reverberations of their broken minds echoed through the corridors of the church basement, a haunting testament to the Reverend's dark mastery. Samuel, ever watchful and silent, ensured the ritual's continuation, a ghost bound to the Reverend's will, complicit in a horror few could understand but none dared challenge. Outside, the world remained unaware of the invisible horrors beneath the steeple, where the absence of sound spoke louder than any scream, and the darkest rituals were performed in the silence of a psalm that never ended. The air in the church basement grew heavier with each passing day, thickened by a new horror that Reverend Whitcomb had carefully devised, an indelible mark meant to bind the captives forever to his will. It began with the cold arrival of Thomas, the town's blacksmith, a man once respected for his craft, now reduced to a trembling tool in the Reverend's relentless hands. Forced to serve as an unwilling accomplice, Thomas heated the iron crosses in his forge until they glowed like the fires of damnation themselves. The searing metal charged not only with heat but with a cruel mixture of powdered herbs and ground minerals. This alchemical blend was no mere pain. It was a slow poison designed to inflame the skin and flesh beneath the mark for days, turning the branding into a lingering agony that refused to heal. The women were brought forward one by one, their bodies trembling, their eyes hollowed by despair. The branding was performed as a grotesque ceremony, a twisted mockery of salvation. The Reverend's hands were steady and precise, pressing the iron cross into their flesh with deliberate force, his voice murmuring prayers that twisted blessing into curse. The sharp hiss of burning flesh filled the chamber, mingling with the stifled sobs and muffled cries. This mark was not punishment alone. It was a symbolic chain that tethered body and soul, branding them as penitent and property simultaneously. The cross etched onto their skin was a cruel reminder of their captivity, a permanent stigma that rendered escape impossible, even if their bodies could break free. The flames that danced beneath the iron ignited nerves in slow waves of torment, a fire that spread beneath the skin long after the metal was lifted. Each woman bore her mark differently, some collapsing in silent agony, others trembling with a fury that simmered beneath the surface. Thomas watched with a growing horror, his hands shaking as he forced the metal to heat again, his mind torn between duty and revulsion. He was a prisoner in his own craft, bound by the Reverend's unyielding grip, compelled to create instruments of torture rather than tools of creation. The ritual was methodical and merciless, and the Reverend took perverse pride in the way the women bore their marks, symbols of both salvation and subjugation. The branding was a physical wound, but also a psychological shackle, stripping away identity and replacing it with the Reverend's twisted gospel. The captive's skin became a living testament to suffering, their bodies canvases for a doctrine of pain and control. As the burns festered and the skin wept, the women's cries grew quieter, swallowed by a numbness born of relentless torment. In this cruel ceremony, the Reverend's mind revealed itself as a dark alchemist, blending faith and cruelty into a ritual that destroyed hope and forged obedience through fire. The church basement reeked of scorched flesh and despair, a place where a man cloaked in sanctity wielded torture as a sacrament, branding innocence with the mark of his ruthless salvation. Thomas, once a maker of tools and protector of his craft, was now a witness and unwilling participant in a darkness that consumed both body and soul. The searing crosses burned their message into the women's flesh, a message of power, possession, and the merciless will of a mind that hid behind the cloak of faith. As the flames dimmed and the cries subsided, the mark remained, a permanent agonizing symbol of the Reverend's dominion, a brand that bound the women not only to their torment but also to the haunting legacy of the church's darkest secrets. The basement of the Old Elm Church was no ordinary cellar. It sprawled beneath the sacred ground like a dark web, twisting and folding into narrow corridors and hidden chambers that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. The cold stone walls were etched deep with cryptic symbols, jagged scratches, and desperate scrawls left by those who had once been prisoners, voices carved into the very fabric of the place. These markings told stories of agony and fleeting hope, messages meant to endure beyond the silence imposed by locked doors and guarded secrets. The Reverend walked these corridors alone, his footsteps echoing softly against the damp stones, listening intently to the subtle creaks and murmurs that filled the air. To him, the church's walls were not inert. They were vessels, absorbing the pain and prayers of the women trapped beneath his feet. He believed the souls of the captives seeped into the mortar and rock, mingling with the cold dust to become part of something larger, a divine testament to his purpose. This belief was a dark thread woven deep into his madness, a conviction that the building itself was a sacred instrument of justice, its very bones sanctified by suffering and penance. The Reverend's mind danced on the edge of reason and delusion, blending his religious fervor with a creeping sense of the supernatural. He saw shadows flickering in corners where no light touched, and heard faint whispers that no one else could hear. Voices of the lost, perhaps, or the murmurs of a divine presence confirming his righteous cruelty. This whispering labyrinth shaped the rhythms of his torment, guiding him as he performed his rituals with grim precision. The women's carvings on the walls were both a haunting record and a challenge, secret signs of resistance hidden beneath layers of fear and despair. Some marks were prayers, others pleas for mercy, and a few were warnings to those who might come after. These silent messages were the only testament to their existence, etched deep with nails or carved with sharp stones, bleeding their stories into the very architecture of their prison. The Reverend studied these signs as though they were scripture, interpreting them through the lens of his fractured faith. Each scratch was a verse, each symbol a parable that justified his mission to cleanse and punish. He believed that through their suffering, these souls were being prepared for a higher reckoning, their anguish sanctified and necessary. The basement's oppressive silence was punctuated only by the subtle groans of the old wood and stone, sounds that seemed to whisper back to the Reverend, confirming the divine nature of his work. The church above remained a beacon of hope to the outside world, but beneath its foundations a living nightmare writhed in darkness and stone. The walls held the echoes of suffering so deep they almost became a presence, a constant companion to the Reverend's twisted rituals. As he moved through the basement, his footsteps careful and deliberate, the lines between faith and madness blurred until they were indistinguishable. He was both priest and jailer, prophet and executioner, guided by voices only he could hear in the shadows. The labyrinthine walls were his cathedral, their whispered secrets feeding his conviction that he was chosen to enact divine justice in the silence below. And so, the church remained a place of worship and horror, its stones forever stained with the whispers of souls trapped between salvation and despair, a macabre testament to a mind that cloaked its darkness in holy light. In the shadowed recesses beneath the Old Elm Church, Reverend Elias Whitcomb's mind extended beyond the spiritual, crossing into the realm of a crude, dark science. His obsession was not merely with the salvation of souls, but with mastering suffering itself, harnessing it as both a tool and a doctrine. Whitcomb had turned to the rudimentary sciences available in his time, early anatomy books, natural philosophy treatises, and whispered knowledge of the human body's fragility, to design tortures that were methodical, precise, and terrifyingly effective. Among his creations, one device stood apart in its merciless ingenuity: the bellows. It was a cold, mechanical contraption crafted from wrought iron and wood, its levers and screws designed to slowly compress the limbs and chest of its victim, tightening with agonizing slowness. The device was a mockery of mercy, its gradual pressure mimicking suffocation not only of the body but also of the spirit. The Reverend believed that this slow crushing was a form of divine purification, a physical and spiritual restraint that forced repentance through the gradual withdrawal of breath and freedom. The bellows worked in cruel harmony with his fanatical mind, blending the mechanical with the mystical, and faith with science twisted into something horrific. Caleb, the local doctor, was drawn unwillingly into this dark enterprise. Known in Harrowsfield for his knowledge of the body and healing, Caleb found himself coerced by the Reverend's unyielding will, summoned into the church's depths under the guise of divine duty. His hands, trained to save lives, were instead forced to assist in perfecting the mechanics of suffering. Caleb's eyes betrayed his horror as he examined the design, recognizing how this device would not kill quickly but torment relentlessly, each turn of the screw stealing breath and hope in equal measure. Under the Reverend's watchful gaze, Caleb helped refine the bellows, adjusting its pressures and mechanics to prolong pain without breaking the fragile vessel of life. The room where the device was kept smelled faintly of oil and cold iron, a sterile yet suffocating atmosphere where human agony was engineered with a cold hand. When the bellows was used, a captive was strapped in carefully, her limbs encased in wooden frames tightened by iron screws. The Reverend would begin the ritual slowly, winding the device with deliberate care, each rotation a quiet command demanding submission. As the pressure increased, the victim's breaths shortened, chest tightening as if the air itself had become a weight pressing down from all sides. It was a torment, both physical and psychological, each shallow breath a reminder of the shrinking space between life and oblivion. The Reverend watched with a detached fascination, his expression calm and unyielding, as if witnessing the workings of a divine machine rather than the suffering of a human being. The bellows was more than torture. It was a sacrament, a ritualized act of control and punishment, forged in the fire of his fanatical mind. Caleb's presence was a grim counterpoint to this, a man trapped between the oath to heal and the compulsion to obey. He saw the slow suffocation for what it was, a mechanical extinction of will and body, a systematic erasure of freedom hidden behind the Reverend's twisted piety. Each use of the bellows left its mark beyond the bruised flesh. The victims emerged hollowed, their spirits bent under the weight of their own struggle to breathe. The device, like the church itself, became a symbol of a faith corrupted, where science served cruelty and compassion was replaced by cold calculation. In this dark marriage of early science and religious fanaticism, the Reverend Whitcomb's mind revealed its deepest horror. A man who saw suffering as salvation and pain as a path to purity, wielding mechanical power to crush not only bodies but the very essence of human dignity. The bellows breathed a slow, merciless life beneath the Old Elm Church, a mechanical heart pumping despair into the shadows. As the Reverend continued his relentless work of molding souls through torment, Abigail's spirit, once fragile and bowed beneath the relentless weight of captivity, began to fracture. But within those cracks flickered a stubborn ember of resistance. The cold, dark basement that sought to erase her identity instead became the secret canvas for her defiance. In the shadows, she etched cryptic symbols onto the walls, lines and shapes born from whispers of old prayers and fragments of forgotten lore, codes meant to carry hope and courage beyond the silence. These marks were subtle, hidden beneath layers of dust and shadow, visible only to those who knew where to look. Silent messages woven into the stone to remind the captives that they were not alone, that their suffering was witnessed and shared. Abigail's defiance was born not in grand gestures, but in the smallest acts. An unspoken glance, a suppressed breath of rebellion, a shared secret with another trembling soul trapped in the same merciless grip. The Reverend, whose mind was a fortress of control and calculation, perceived the shift with quiet menace. His punishments grew harsher, designed to crush the faintest sparks of hope before they could ignite a flame. Abigail was subjected repeatedly to the bellows, the cruel apparatus tightening its iron grip slowly, suffocating not just her body but attempting to strangle her will. The slow compression forced her to confront the edge of oblivion, the thin line where flesh and spirit might break. Yet each time she emerged, hollowed but unbroken. The silent symbols on the walls grew bolder, their meaning deepening as more captives dared to glimpse the coded defiance. Abigail's influence spread like a whispered contagion. Her courage seeped into the others, planting seeds of unity amid the despair. The women began to exchange glances that held unspoken understanding, their movements becoming small rebellions against the unyielding order the Reverend sought to impose. These subtle shifts, the tightening of a shared grip, a secret touch, a quiet breath held in solidarity, undermined the absolute control the Reverend wielded like a dark god. The basement, once a place of total domination, became a crucible of fragile hope. Abigail's markings, those cryptic sigils carved in trembling hands, were more than scratches on stone. They were prayers transformed into resistance, a language of survival that the Reverend could neither hear nor erase. His growing paranoia was palpable in the shadows, his eyes flickering with a cold fury as he sensed the quiet rebellion stirring beneath his feet. The tension thickened, a silent storm gathering in the oppressive stillness, threatening to unravel the web of torment with threads of unity and defiance. Abigail's fractured spirit became a beacon, a haunted flame flickering in the darkness, fragile yet fierce. In a place designed to silence and break, she found a way to speak without words, to lead without voice, and to fight without weapons. Her resistance was both a rebellion of the body and a battle for the soul, a testament to the human will's capacity to endure and defy even the most methodical and ritualistic cruelty. As the Reverend tightened his grip in desperation, the basement's oppressive silence began to crack, and with it, the carefully constructed facade of absolute power. The story of Abigail's defiance was no longer just a whispered secret. It was the first tremor of a reckoning yet to come. Beneath the ancient stones of the Old Elm Church lay a crypt unlike any other, sealed tight against the outside world, a tomb crafted not for the dead, but for the living condemned. It was here that Reverend Elias Whitcomb enacted his darkest ritual, known only as the vanishing prayer. This was a punishment beyond pain, a slow, merciless erasure of existence that defied the visible bounds of suffering. Esther, a newcomer marked for this fate, was brought to the crypt with quiet solemnity. Her body was carefully prepared, fitted with fragile bellows strapped across her chest and abdomen, delicate instruments designed to capture each breath she took, measuring the slow retreat of life with cruel precision. The bellows expanded and contracted with agonizing slowness, like a mockery of her fading presence, a mechanical heartbeat recording the slow retreat of her being. The chamber itself was a coffin of darkness and suffocation, sealed airtight to deny her even the smallest gift of fresh air. Light was a distant memory here. The absence of it was a cold, crushing weight pressing down upon her, strangling the edges of sanity until the line between life and death blurred into an indistinguishable shadow. The Reverend's voice rose in the crypt's suffocating silence, a low chant that twisted sacred prayer into a dirge of control and domination. Each word was carefully chosen, a litany that danced on the thin edge between mercy and annihilation, binding Esther's fading breath to his will. He recited passages that spoke of cleansing through darkness, of the soul's journey through the void, as if her extinction was a sacrament, a final passage into some higher plane ordained by divine justice. Yet this was no mercy. The vanishing prayer was a slow death that left no mark on flesh, no outward sign of violence, only the hollow echo of breath lost in the growing silence. Esther's body weakened with every passing hour, the bellow's steady rhythm the only proof that she was still alive, a fragile flicker of existence shrinking toward oblivion. In the depths of the crypt, her mind spiraled into a void where time lost meaning and fear became a constant companion. The absence of light gnawed at her memory, and the thinning air sharpened the edges of delirium. Each breath was a struggle, each heartbeat a battle against the encroaching void. The ritual was terrifying in its clinical calm, the deliberate withdrawal of life drawn out like a slow thread unraveling from the fabric of being. Above the crypt, the church remained still and serene, its steeple reaching toward the heavens as if untouched by the horrors beneath. The Reverend's madness cloaked in piety was hidden behind this innocent facade, a man who believed himself an instrument of divine will, wielding extinction itself as a sacred tool. Esther's vanishing was not just a physical act but a psychological obliteration, a carefully orchestrated surrender to silence and darkness that left the soul untethered and invisible. The bellows recorded every fragile breath as testimony to her slow disappearance, a haunting rhythm that marked the steady retreat from life. This ritual, unlike any other, revealed the depths of the Reverend's cruelty, a mind so methodical and merciless that it sought to erase without trace, to extinguish hope in the quietest possible way. The vanishing prayer was not just torture. It was the ultimate denial of presence, a ritualized erasure that left no scars but bore witness to a slow, deliberate death hidden beneath the sanctity of faith. As Esther's breaths grew faint and the darkness deepened, the crypt became a silent witness to a vanishing too complete to see, a shadow swallowed by the very prayers meant to save her. The slow, steady chant of the Reverend echoed in the stillness, binding life and death in a terrifying dance, a final act in a nightmare that stretched far beyond the walls of the church basement. Outside the Old Elm Church, life went on with the steady rhythm of the seasons, but beneath the surface, whispers began to stir, quiet rumors that crept like shadows through the village of Harrowsfield. Jonathan Pierce, the local constable, was a man bound by duty and haunted by unease. He had long admired Reverend Whitcomb's calm presence and the church's outward tranquility, but faint, unsettling signs began to prick at his conscience. Women spoke in hushed tones about neighbors who vanished without a trace. Strange sounds echoing from beneath the church late at night, and the heavy, watchful silence that seemed to hang over the town like a shroud. Yet every step Jonathan took toward the truth met an impenetrable wall of religious reverence and fear. The church was the heart of the community, its steeple a symbol of divine protection and moral order. To question the Reverend was to challenge the very foundation of the town's faith. Townsfolk closed ranks, their eyes wary and their voices low, warning Jonathan that some things were best left unspoken. He found himself caught in a tightening noose of denial, where superstition and devotion combined to shield darkness beneath a veneer of holiness. Jonathan's investigation was suffocated by this silence. Files vanished, testimonies were withheld, and doors were firmly closed. His own doubts grew heavier with each dead end, the weight of unseen eyes watching his every move. The power structures that protected the Reverend were subtle but absolute, woven into the fabric of the town's obedience and fear. Even as Jonathan pieced together fragments of truth, the town's collective will seemed bent on preserving the facade of normalcy. He wrestled with a torment of conscience, torn between his oath to protect and the chilling realization that exposing the Reverend could unravel the community itself. This tension gnawed at him, a slow erosion of certainty as he stood at the edge of a precipice, facing not only the darkness within the church walls, but also the deeper shadow of a society unwilling to confront its own complicity. Jonathan Pierce became a solitary figure in this growing storm, a man seeking justice in a place where justice was buried beneath faith and fear. The outside world's watchful eyes were dimmed by the town's heavy silence, a silence that whispered of secrets too terrible to speak aloud. In this crucible of denial, the Reverend's macabre dominion thrived, shielded by the very reverence that should have been its undoing. Jonathan's struggle was not just against a single man's evil, but against the invisible walls built by belief and silence, walls that suffocated truth and protected a darkness hidden in plain sight. In the suffocating darkness of the church basement, where shadows clung to every cracked stone and despair hung thick in the stale air, the captive's silent resistance finally erupted into a desperate uprising. Abigail, whose spirit had endured countless torments and whose cryptic symbols had sown fragile threads of hope among the women, emerged as the reluctant leader of this fragile rebellion. The stolen keys, pilfered in moments of quiet cunning, and the hidden tools, crude yet deadly in their simplicity, became instruments of rebellion wielded in trembling hands. As the Reverend began one of his cold, ritualistic ceremonies, his voice rising in the hollow chamber with a twisted cadence, the basement transformed from prison to battleground. The air filled with screams, raw, jagged cries born of years of silent suffering suddenly unleashed in a cacophony of fear and fury. Shadows writhed and collided as captives fought back against the methodical cruelty that had sought to erase their very souls. Every inch of the labyrinthine space became a stage for desperate violence, a struggle between the Reverend's calculated torment and the raw, unyielding will to survive. The cold iron implements meant to inflict pain were met with fists and stolen blades. The suffocating walls echoed with the chaos of rebellion, a tempest breaking loose after years of silence. Yet even in the heat of their defiance, the cost was cruelly high. The Reverend's cold mind anticipated treachery with a monstrous precision, turning his instruments of salvation into instruments of slaughter. Blood soaked the stones, the scent of it thick and raw, mingling with the acrid smoke of fear. The women fell one by one, their bodies broken, but their spirits fiercely unwilling to yield. Amid the chaos, Abigail's eyes caught a horrifying truth, a revelation that twisted the very nature of their torment into something far more sinister than mere imprisonment. The sanctuary beneath the church, the labyrinth that had swallowed so many lives, was not just a prison or a temple of cruelty. It was a vessel for something darker, something the Reverend had summoned beyond mere human depravity. Symbols carved deep into the walls glowed faintly in the flickering light, ancient sigils that whispered of otherworldly forces and unholy pacts. The Reverend was not merely a man cloaked in twisted faith. He was a conduit for a malevolence that fed on suffering and silence, a puppeteer entwined with shadows far older than the village itself. This revelation shattered the fragile hope that had fueled the revolt, casting the survivors into a deeper abyss of terror. The basement's final cry was not just the sound of rebellion, it was the scream of innocence lost to a darkness that defied salvation or escape. As the last echoes of battle faded into silence, the Reverend's sanctuary stood revealed for what it truly was, a monstrous altar where faith was perverted into a ritual of sacrifice and where the line between human cruelty and supernatural horror blurred into a nightmare beyond comprehension. The uprising had tested the limits of human will, but the true horror that awaited beneath the church walls was a shadow that no mortal defiance could banish. The Old Elm Church stood silent at last, its doors barred and windows shuttered, a hushed monument to horrors once concealed beneath its sacred walls. The Reverend Elias Whitcomb had vanished without a trace, slipping away like a shadow dissolved by the dawn, leaving behind a labyrinth of shattered lives and whispered nightmares. The surviving women emerged from the basement prison with bodies marked by the scars of cruelty, burned crosses branded into flesh, bruises that spoke of relentless torment, and wounds carved as deeply into their souls as into their skin. Their eyes held haunted distances, flickers of a terror no healing could erase. They carried with them the weight of unspeakable suffering, a silent testament to the darkness that had thrived under the guise of holiness. In the years that followed, the town of Harrowsfield struggled to reconcile the horror that had lain beneath its faith, grappling with disbelief, shame, and a desperate need for justice. The revelation sparked a slow-burning reckoning far beyond the village boundaries, shaking the very foundations of religious authority across the region. Laws were rewritten, and new safeguards were imposed, aiming to hold sacred institutions accountable and to pierce the veil behind which evil so often hid. These reforms bore the scars of tragedy, a grim legacy carved by the cost of silence and misplaced trust. By the edge of the towering pine trees where the church once cast its long shadow, a memorial rose, a silent sentinel of stone and iron, simple yet unyielding. It stood as a reminder, a place where the whispered names of the lost women could echo in the wind, and where the community could confront the darkness it once refused to see. The memorial was not just for mourning, but a warning etched in time, that evil often wears the mask of salvation, cloaked in normalcy and piety, thriving in silence and reverence. The story of Reverend Whitcomb and his sanctuary beneath the church was a grim reflection on how cruelty can root itself in trust and faith, and how monsters sometimes walk openly among us, shielded by the very structures meant to protect. The survivors' wounds, both visible and invisible, underscored the fragile line between devotion and domination, between care and control. Their quiet resilience became a beacon in the shadows, a testament to the human spirit's struggle to endure and remember. As the years passed, the church remained a hollow relic, its stones heavy with the echoes of suffering and the whispers of those who dared to resist. The legacy left behind was a chilling reminder that evil need not wear horns or wield chains to bind. It can hide behind a smile, a prayer, or a promise of salvation, waiting patiently in plain sight until the silence is broken. And when that silence finally shatters, it demands that the world listen, remember, and never again allow darkness to creep unnoticed beneath the light. Evil often wears the softest mask, one shaped by calm words, gentle smiles, and the promise of salvation. It hides behind the familiar, a preacher's collar, a neighbor's kindness, the quiet routine of daily life. This is the most terrifying truth, that darkness does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, weaving itself into the very fabric of trust and faith until it becomes invisible. Reverend Whitcomb's sanctuary beneath the church was not just a prison of stone and iron. It was a reflection of how evil can hide behind normalcy, cloaked in rituals that seem sacred and motives that appear righteous. His cruelty was methodical, slow, and deliberate, exploiting silence as both weapon and shield. Silence is its own kind of prison where screams go unheard and truths are buried beneath fear, reverence, or denial. Evil thrives where voices are muted, where people choose blindness over confrontation, and where power goes unchecked beneath the guise of holiness. The captive's suffering hidden beneath prayers and sermons reminds us that evil is not always a spectacle. It is often a quiet decay, eating away at the soul of a community until the rot becomes too deep to ignore. This darkness demands more than horror. It demands reflection. How many shadows linger behind the facades we trust? How many silent prisons exist beyond the walls we see? History warns us that such evil can return, not always as a monstrous figure, but as a subtle presence, waiting, patient, masked. The legacy of Reverend Whitcomb's sanctuary is a chilling call to vigilance, a reminder that evil's greatest strength lies in its ability to hide and silence. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could darkness walk quietly among us, wearing the guise of normalcy while the world turns a deaf ear?